Hey, hi, how you going? It's your main Boss Rider, and we're back with another unit upgrade guide to talk about Schism. Now, the aim of this video is just to help inform your decision making and give you a little bit of insight into each of the unit's strengths and weaknesses so that you can understand which one is going to be best for you based on your playstyle. Let's check it out. Okay, so we're going to start off at tier 1 and just go tier by tier. But before we do, remember, if you enjoy this content and you find it informative, like, comment, and subscribe. It really helps support the channel a lot. Now, Schism as a faction overall, I do feel like is incredibly powerful, but I also feel like they're one of the more complicated factions and more difficult to master. At least for me, it feels like it took me the longest out of all the factions to properly come to terms with. And I think part of that complexity comes from the value of the units not merely coming from their stats, or at least less so than the other factions, but more so residing in all of their different abilities, like their active abilities, and understanding how you want to be using these. So for that reason, it took me a long time to properly test all of the units in Schism. I've played somewhere between 10 and 20 games on them now, which I know still isn't a lot overall, but that's more than I'd played the other factions before I felt comfortable jumping in here to give you guys this upgrade guide. But at tier 1, we've got a choice between the Ferocious and the Stinging Rashoth. And the main difference is honestly just whether or not you want a ranged unit or a melee unit. But notably, the melee version does also have sweeping strikes, which is going to allow it to hit multiple targets. And I think that is ultimately the ability that is going to push it over the edge. So I almost always go with the Ferocious Rashoth. It's got a little less initiative, which is a little bit annoying, but it's got more speed. You obviously aren't too worried about the speed on the ranged unit because it's a ranged unit. But overall, I don't feel like either of these upgrades is particularly strong, and I would not prioritize upgrading this unit very early in the game at all. I would push your economy towards just getting more of these higher tier units instead, and then only bother upgrading these when you really don't have much else to do with your resources. In fact, if I'm being completely honest, one of the primary roles of the Rashoth is just to serve as a sacrificial lamb and go out there and get killed. And that's one of the other reasons I prefer the Ferocious Rashoth, because as a melee unit, that's just going to happen more naturally given that it's out there on the front line. Now, the reason you want that is because your tier 4 and tier 7 units are going to have this Summoning Rite ability, which allows you to create permanent stacks of them from the dead bodies of your other stacks. So you need these guys to go out there and die so that you can really capitalize on this other ability. I don't feel like this is going to be one of those tier 7 units that you want to conserve your numbers of and build a power stack around. You're much better off just effectively upgrading them. Moving on to tier 2, we've got a choice between the Binder and the Votary as upgrades for our cultists. Now, both of these units are going to be incredibly strong. You can't really go wrong with either of them. It's just going to come down to your preference of which debuff you want. So personally, I prefer the Binder because of the Abyssal Tendril ability, which is going to do a little bit of damage, but it is also going to cast a free shackle and remove the enemy's counterattack charges. I really like that. Both of these abilities are only going to cost you 1 focus charge, same with the Votary's abilities. And overall, I would say that Schism is the best focus charge, focus point faction in the game. So you do want to build your hero into this because all of your creatures are going to have very good focus charge abilities that you do want to be using every single round if you can. So if there ever was an energized faction, this is the one to do it on. I just prefer this Abyssal Tendril. The Votary's abilities are going to reduce your enemy's initiative or their speed, as well as do a little bit of damage, which is really good. And possibly once we start getting PvP, they may become more valuable. But for now, it's going to be the Abyssal Tendril for me. Moving straight into tier 3, we're looking at upgrades for the Ugashoth Rider here. So we have a choice between the red pill and the blue pill. Now, what I think this is ultimately going to come down to is how much you value this extra initiative. So for the Ugashoth Tamer, we are going to have mostly better stats across the board with the exception of HP. But I think the abilities on Old Mate Martha here do make it the slightly better upgrade, at least in my opinion. This is the one I pick most of the time, especially if you are playing a magic hero. And the reason for that is the synergy between the Piercing Cold passive ability and the Icy Spikes active ability. So Piercing Cold is going to apply a debuff to your enemies that will cause them to take an additional 100% magic damage anytime they are hit with an attack, counterattack, or an ability. And that last part is really important because the Icy Spikes ability is an AoE effect. So it's going to apply that debuff to multiple enemies at the same time. Now, notably, the Agashov Tamer does have the piercing cold passive as well, but over here it only works with attacks and counterattacks, and its active ability, Icy Breath, is only going to deal single target damage. So I think for that reason, if you're playing a magic hero, I would rather go with Old Mate Martha, but if you're playing a might hero, maybe you want to go with the Tamer just for that extra initiative. In the tier 4 slot, we're looking at upgrades for the Grand Shoth, and these are incredibly powerful tier 4 units. I would say they're the only unit that really rivals the Minotaur. They're definitely an S tier unit overall. And what makes them so good is their summoning right ability, which we talked a little bit about earlier when we looked at tier 1. So this is going to allow you to summon stacks of these, which are permanent, by the way, from the dead bodies of your allies. So this incentivizes you in the early game to just recruit as many creatures as you can. You want to be hitting up all the dwellings. You want to hire as many heroes as you can. You want to release as many heroes as you can, just to get any amount of numbers of any units from any faction, send them into battle, clear out all those early game stacks, and if those units die, who cares? You can just then convert them into Unspeakable Shoth. So you're clearing out the map and growing your power stack, and that is an incredibly strong combination early on. And as for which unit upgrade is going to be the best for you, I think it really just depends on whether or not you are able to generate enough focus points to frequently use the Black Ice Shard ability. So this is going to be an incredibly strong active ability. It's going to do a ton of damage. It's going to be a ranged attack, and it's not going to end the turn. So it doesn't cost you your basic attack. It's also going to be really great for clearing out the Mirage, because if you've got a large enough stack of the Unthinkable Shoth, you can just use this ability to one-shot the other stack, and in the Mirage, you always go first. So it's really nice for that. It's a pretty niche scenario, but nonetheless, it is an upside. And you also have all of this extra initiative, which I value highly. However, the Unspeakable Shoth is still incredibly powerful. I think overall, it probably is going to do a bit more damage, mainly because of the cooldown on the active abilities. So you're not going to be able to spam this literally every turn, unless you're also combining it with spells that remove or reduce your cooldowns. But I think just having a double strike unit with extra speed is going to be incredibly strong. You're going to be able to fly out there further, hit your enemies where it matters the most, and just do a bit more damage with the Unspeakable Shoth. But I still really like the utility of Black Ice Shard and the extra initiative. So for me, it's the Unthinkable, but I would not fault anyone at all for using the Unspeakable Shoth. I think both of these upgrades are S tier units. Moving into tier 5, we're talking about upgrades for the Concubus. So our choice here is between the Mistress of Chains and the Bewitcher. And this one is not particularly close in my opinion. This is one of the more lopsided decisions throughout the faction. If you really just want the extra damage, then you can go with the Bewitcher. You've got better damage stats, you've got an ability that's going to deal damage, and you've got the Duelist passive, which means you suffer no penalty in melee combat. The Bewitcher obviously being a ranged unit, same with the Mistress of Chains. However, I think overall, the Mistress of Chains is just far better. You've got two incredibly powerful debuff active abilities, so you can prevent the target from using active abilities, which is especially good in the mirror match if you're playing against another Schism faction. And you've got the Hourglass ability, which blocks the hero's active abilities. However, the thing that really puts this one over the edge is the Earn Your Abilities gear passive, which is going to generate 3 focus points every time you deal damage. And like we've been talking about this entire time, Schism is a faction that wants to build as many focus charges as possible, so anything that will give you points towards those focus charges is incredibly valuable. I pick the Mistress of Chains pretty much every time. The only game I've not picked the Mistress of Chains was my very first game on the demo ever, and that's just because I had no idea what a focus charge was. Tier 6 is up next though, so we've got a choice between the Rift Arbiter and the Bloated Arbiter. Now this is another one that is pretty lopsided in my opinion, though not so much as the Tier 5 was. I think the Rift Arbiter is probably an S tier unit, whereas the Bloated Arbiter is maybe A tier. Both are still incredibly strong, don't get me wrong there. You can't really go wrong here, but I think the Rift Arbiter is just significantly better, and it's mostly thanks to its active abilities. So we've got 2 active abilities here that are going to allow you to control the positioning of your enemies and push them around the map. And this is an incredibly fun ability. It feels particularly cruel to just shove around an enemy that you've slowed with web or something like that. But the main reason it's really nice is it doesn't end the turn, which we've been talking about is incredibly powerful, and it pushes your enemies back so that you get more damage out of the paradoxical shots ability. So the Rift Arbiter is going to actually have the inverse effect that most ranged units have, where they do less damage over range. This is actually going to do more damage the more range there is. So you want to push those enemies back to have them as far away from your Rift Arbiter as possible. And trust me on this one, these guys hit like an absolute truck. If you are able to consistently deal damage to your enemies at full range with either of the Arbiters, you are going to be an incredibly happy Schism player. But the last thing we need to talk about on the Rift Arbiter is the Disgorge Storm ability, which is a really nice debuff. This is going to lower the enemy speed and initiative, and it pairs really well with the fact that the Rift Arbiter has a higher initiative. So that means you're going to be able to get this ability off earlier in the turn order, and therefore put your creatures above the opponent's creatures in that turn order as well. However, the Rift Arbiter is not without its perks, and the most interesting one to me is the Frozen Pages ability, which I think is going to become much more valuable when we eventually get PvP. But the problem with it at the moment is just that the enemy AI isn't that good with spells, to be honest. So at least I don't feel like I get that much utility out of it. But it's also got the Slimy Touch passive, which is going to apply that debuff we talked about before whenever you deal damage at all. So it's a nice way to not have to sacrifice your turn to apply this debuff. You can just start shooting at enemies and apply that debuff. But I don't really think this outweighs being able to just apply it to all of your enemies at once, even if it is taking your turn off. I think overall the Rift Arbiter is better at the moment, but maybe when we get PvP, that equation starts to change a little bit. But we've made it all the way to tier 7, so we're looking at upgrades for the Abyssal Envoy, and I really like this unit. I've seen a lot of people complain about the design here, but for me, this actually reminds me of a Chasm Fiend out of the Stormlight Archive, if you're a fan of that series. I don't know, it's just like, I know it's a little bit different, but it reminds me of it. It's just a big carapace, weird looking creature, so that's it. That's the association there. But either way, choosing our upgrades is going to be incredibly difficult because both of these are pretty good. But what I think is ultimately going to decide this for you is whether or not you want to be playing around with the Mind Control ability, which is incredibly powerful. We'll come back to that in just a moment. Or if you just want the extra damage from the Area Strike on the Abyssal Overseer. So you are going to get a lower or a larger range on your damage roll for the Overseer. We roll 35 up to 70, but we're always going to hit that 70 on the Abyssal Executor. But I think overall, obviously the extra targets that you are going to hit probably makes up for that damage loss. And if you've got any effects that cause you to deal maximum damage with your rolls, then the Abyssal Overseer is definitely going to be doing more damage. However, coming back to this Mind Control ability, this is an incredibly powerful effect. I think the only problem with this effect is that the initiative on the Executor is not that high, at least compared to the other tier 7 units. So the dragons are going to be higher initiative, the vampires are going to be higher and equal initiative, and then the angels have equal or lower initiative. So they've got 12 or 9, depending on whether or not they pick the Archangel or the other one. And I think most people are going for the Archangel, which is the one with 12 initiative, so it's equal there. So you're not going to be able to just like perma-lock your opponent's tier 7s, but there are a lot of ways to increase your initiative. So there's probably a viable build there somewhere. I expect it involves splitting out your stacks so that your smaller stacks can focus on locking down all of your enemies while your larger stack just deals a bunch of damage. I don't know, I'll leave that one to the theory crafters down below, but I think overall, if you're a very tactically minded player and you're honestly just better at me at that kind of tactical thinking, then you are probably going to get more out of the Abyssal Executor. It feels like one of those things where there's something there and I just don't understand what it is. So for me, I go with the Abyssal Overseer most of the time just because I'm a caveman and I like dealing all of that extra splash damage. But that's going to do it for this one. I hope you guys found this helpful and let me know in the comments down below which upgrades you prefer. But otherwise, thank you for watching. I'll catch you next time. Have a good one.